Welcome to Cybersecurity Today. This is the Week in Review edition for the week ending Friday, June 21st, 2024. I'm Howard Solomon, contributing reporter on cybersecurity for TechNewsDay.com. In a few minutes, David Shipley, head of Beauceron Security, will be here to discuss recent news. We'll delve into an investigation into the hack of an organization that went undetected for perhaps as long as 3 years. More detail on Snowflake attacks, and allegations by Australia's Privacy Commissioner of what caused a huge data breach at a medical insurance provider. But before we get to the discussion, here's a look at some of the headlines from the past 7 days. Consulting radiologists. A Minnesota-based radiology service for clinics and hospitals is notifying over 500,000 people their personal data was stolen. Information includes names, addresses, dates of birth, social security numbers, medical information, and health insurance information. The Department of Public Health for Los Angeles County said a February data breach resulted in the theft of personal information of more than 200,000 people. It started with staff falling for a phishing attack, resulting in the theft of email login credentials of 53 Public Health Department employees. Data copied included names, dates of birth, social security numbers, medical diagnoses, some financial information, and more. Santander Holdings USA, the American arm of the Santander Bank Group, is notifying over 12,000 employees of a data theft. In a letter to staff, the company says the information stolen came from a third-party database used by a Santander affiliate. Employee information copied includes names, social security numbers, and bank account information used for direct deposit for payroll. A 2-hour outage of the 9/11 emergency response system across Massachusetts this week was caused by a firewall issue. Security Week reports some emergency calls to the systems couldn't get through. However, the system saw phone numbers calling in, so dispatch centers could call them back and find out if people needed help. The company that provides the 911 system couldn't explain why the firewall affected its service, but it says it has applied a technical solution to make sure the incident isn't repeated. 2 American companies that didn't run required pre-production cybersecurity tests on a federal emergency rent application that they oversaw have agreed to pay millions of dollars to settle claims they violated federal law. Guidehouse Inc., which was the prime contractor, paid $7.6 million, while Nan McKay and Associates, a subcontractor, paid $3.7 million. The companies agreed that had the required software tests been done before the application went live, they might have detected and stopped an information security breach. 2 American residents have been charged with allegedly running the criminal online marketplace called Empire Market. The Department of Homeland Security said the marketplace ran between 2018 and 2020. Charges include conspiracy for drug trafficking, computer fraud, counterfeiting, and money laundering. Over 3 years, the site facilitated transactions worth more than $430 million. And finally, Google released an update for the Chrome browser to plug 6 vulnerabilities. Windows users should be on a version that starts with 126 and ends in 115. Joining me now from Halifax, Nova Scotia, is David Shipley, head of Beauceron Security. Hi there.
Hi, Howard.
Let's start with a forensic analysis report that was done on a 3-year compromise of an unnamed organization. It was done by investigators at an Israeli company called Signia. The attacker is a suspected and very sophisticated China-based threat actor. The goal was espionage. The compromise was discovered late last year. The investigation found the organization had been infiltrated about 3 years earlier. Talk about persistence. And not just in terms of dwell time. This gang, which Signia calls Velvet Ant, had multiple footholds in the victim organization. After being discovered when the defenders shut one door, the attacker quickly pivoted to another. David, what struck you in reading this report?
Well, my first thought, obviously, is the length of the operation that we're talking about here. 3 years is a crazy amount of time for someone to be inside of your network. I mean, oftentimes we talk about that 200-day average that someone might be in a network, but we're talking about something that 3 times plus that, and that's probably the most important evidence that this is nation state activity, even more so than say the tooling or the tactics they're using. Criminals don't have time to sit around for 3 years not making money. But if you're on a government payroll, well, different set of motivations. And so while no criminal hacking group has the patience to be around and try not to monetize this makes sense if your objectives are different than that. And I think it highlights that when we hear the phrase advanced persistent threat, and between advanced and persistent, it's persistent that matters the most when we hear that and delivers the most value.
It isn't clear how this organization was initially compromised. What caught my eye, though, was the number of blunders that IT leaders at this organization apparently made. Here's one of them. It had two F5 big IP appliances on the network. Now, these are for things like firewall and load balancing. The attacker compromised both and used them for its internal command and control communications. And how were these devices compromised? Well, they weren't supposed to be in production on the network live. They were installed a long time ago as part of a disaster recovery plan, but the project wasn't completed. So, meanwhile, they stayed forgotten on the network, forgotten and unpatched, which is how they were compromised. This is running an outdated operating system and open on the internet. Isn't this cybersecurity 101? Do an inventory of all the hardware and software that you have.
Howard, absolutely. But what we've been hearing repeatedly all year this year on all fronts with all of the big breaches is this repeat hit song, "The basics are hard." And here's the thing, criminals are increasingly doing cyber judo on defenders, flipping them on their backs using their own defensive tools. And if you aren't keeping these systems A, tracked, B, up to date, I'd argue in some ways it's probably worse to have a vulnerable security tool like an F5, a Fortinet, a Cisco, a Palo Alto, yada, 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 than to have nothing at all because of the false sense of security you're getting. I think the damnable part about this being the disaster recovery plan project that never ended that causes the disaster is probably the cherry on the overall pain cake that we're hearing here. I think this is an increasing issue. The forgotten about infrastructure problem is also what got Microsoft in the Chinese hack that was investigated by the US Cybersecurity Review Board. And this is, by the way, this is unsexy stuff. There are no vendor silver bullets for this problem. And anyone that is promising you that is full of garbage. We've had solutions on the market for asset discovery, classification, and management for years. And no, dear AI overhypers, cool your jets. No generative AI LLM is going to solve this problem either. This is a people, process, culture, and tech problem. And that means it's messy.
Here's what I thought was blunder number two. While IT had commendably installed an EDR solution, that's endpoint detection and remediation, apparently it was only on all of the company's PCs. The EDR wasn't on the Windows servers. So remember when I told you when the defender started kicking the attacker out of several footholds, it went on to compromise the Windows servers, and with no EDR, that wasn't noticed. And then the attacker activated previously deployed plugx remote action Trojans that had been dormant in the environment. and continued the attack.
So I'm not sure if this counts as a blunder when I was looking through the report, and it was just it was interesting to think about a 3-year long campaign and how far do the logs go back, man? How much are you missing from that story? Very few organizations I know have more than a year's worth of logs. Very, very few organizations, and most don't have a year. And so, part of the story about this unpatched F5 boxes was interesting, but I feel like we're missing other important aspects. Like, I wonder what else was part of the story, i.e., phishing, and that could have played a role in delivering this initial malware to the target. And I also was thinking a little bit, again, not in the blunder category, because I think this is a lot more common than not, but how hard it is for people to visualize security coverage. And I mean, maybe this is one of those emergent spaces where augmented reality or different ways of visualizing complex systems and data need to come into play. If you're doing physical pen tests on an organization, you're trying to break in, you look to see where the camera blind spots are. And that's exactly what happened here. Your EDR is your camera on the corner of the building. And if you've got blind spots, guess what? That's exactly where the criminals are going to go. And, I think that's interesting.
Is this a problem in many organizations that you see? They only put EDR on workstations, on desktops, and they forget about putting EDR on servers?
I think there's a couple of different layers that come into the complexity of security monitoring tools in a server environment, particularly as we've had this giant push towards microservices and virtualization and layers of abstraction. And, every time you're putting agents and systems and processes in place on servers, you're imposing strain and costs and balances. And people would argue there are other mitigating controls. It's not easy to decide these things. It seems obvious in hindsight, but depending on where in the production order, the stack, the other controls, it may be more complex than what we're doing. And I think this also goes to like just how hard this can be. Particularly, let's take you've got a production environment where you've got servers, Windows or Linux, that are absolutely have to be high availability and patching updates, etc. And you really have a strict process on updates and a lower tolerance for disruption. Security tools can sometimes be tricky balancing act with that. I think in an ideal world, you've got layers of observation, lots of cameras watching that corner of the building. And if you don't have anything, no EDR, no monitoring, no other way of telling something bad, then it's going to hurt.
Well, certainly a factor in this case, it seems that a lack of device and network logging that would have highlighted suspicious activity.
Well, yeah, and that's the other camera, right? Like, if you can't put an EDR on it, but you can establish a baseline with a SIM or some other network analysis tool where you're monitoring traffic. So maybe you didn't catch them break the glass in and get in, but then you caught them rummaging around. And this might have been also something where canary tokens might have been useful or some other monitoring tools besides EDR. I mean, EDR is good for what it does, but it's not every security problem is a nail and requiring the EDR hammer. The 3 years to catch this attack tells you a lot. And particularly as we hear more and more warnings from the FBI about China's intention in particular to gain persistence in these kind of large, important, critical infrastructure like firms and to leverage that access for disruption in the event of a conflict, say they invade Taiwan. Um, I think lots of folks probably could read this report, pay attention to the findings about the basics, and ask hard questions, but avoid throwing rocks from glass houses because this story of the basics biting us in the backside is the story of 2024's major breaches.
Okay, let's move on. News item 2. Australia's Information Commissioner details alleged causes of the huge hack of personal data from medical insurance provider Medibank. In 2022, a threat actor believed to be a member of the Our Evil ransomware gang stole data on 9.7 million Australians from Medibank. This week, Australia's privacy commissioner filed a lawsuit alleging Medibank failed to take reasonable steps to protect that data. How was Medibank compromised? Allegedly through an IT outsourcing firm that provided help desk services. An employee had both standard access and administrative accounts. He saved his Medibank username and password to his personal internet browser profile on the work computer that he used. But when he later signed into his internet browser profile on his personal computer, the Medibank credentials synchronized across to his personal PC. Well, that admin account gave access to most, if not all, Medibank IT systems. Apparently, his personal computer was later compromised because an attacker was able to install credential stealing malware. And so, with the contractor's username and password, the hacker was able to log into Medibank's Microsoft Exchange server to test access for the admin account. And then a week later, the attacker logged into Medibank's VPN, which was not protected with multi-factor authentication. And with stolen credentials to other systems, the attacker copied that huge amount of data. It's also alleged that Medibank's endpoint detection and response software generated several alerts of suspicious activity. However, those alerts weren't triaged or escalated either by Medibank or its IT service provider. Now, none of this has been proven in an Australian court of law. However, last year Medibank...
Howard, sorry. Hey, all good. He might be. I'm just waiting to find out. He just texted me. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm working through it. Thank you. Oh, wow. Sorry, Howard. Do you mind doing that again?
Okay. So I'll start again from the top. All right, let's move on to news item 2. Australia's Information Commissioner details alleged causes of the huge hack of personal data from medical insurance provider Medibank. In 2022, a threat actor believed to be a member of the Our Evil ransomware gang stole data on 9.7 million Australians from Medibank. This week, Australia's privacy commissioner filed a lawsuit alleging Medibank failed to take reasonable steps to protect that data. How was Medibank compromised? Allegedly through an IT outsourcing firm that provided help desk services. An employee who had both a standard access and administrative access accounts saved his Medibank username and password to his personal internet browser profile on the work computer that he used. And then when he later signed into his internet browser profile on his personal computer, the Medibank credentials synchronized across to his personal PC. His admin account gave access to most, if not all, Medibank IT systems. Apparently, his personal computer was later compromised because a hacker was able to install credential stealing malware and get that username and password. So with the contractor's username and password, the hacker was able to log into Medibank's VPN, which wasn't protected with multi-factor authentication, and then got a hold of stolen credentials to other systems and copied data. It's also alleged that Medibank's endpoint detection and response software did generate several alerts of suspicious activity. However, those alerts weren't triaged or escalated either by Medibank or its IT service provider. Now, none of this has been proven in an Australian court of law. However, last year, Medibank did acknowledge that its systems were accessed using a stolen credential from a third-party IT provider. David, what did you think when you read the Privacy Commissioner's statement of claim?
Out. All I can say is Ouch. This is not the first time we've heard about the third party outsourcing biting an organization right in the backside. And if we recall a couple of years ago, the Okta breach, it was the third party outsourced contractor in Latin America, and they were targeted and they used MFA bypass and shenanigans. So what's troubling here is everything I've heard in the industry this year has been budgets getting slashed, costs getting tightened, jobs getting outsourced, AI coming in. And so this rush for the cost containment, inflation fighting side of things is going to lead to more of these kinds of things. And, this is also, I think, a couple of interesting process and policy gaps along the way. Like, let's start off with the syncing of the password. So many enterprise CISOs that I talk to are very reluctant still to have password management tools deployed to enterprise customers because what happens if the password manager gets breached, et cetera. Well, I can tell you what happens if you don't have those tools. People will use things that you really, really don't want them to use. We have to make sure that we're equipping individuals with the tools to do their job. Good news, they had a standard and admin account. Yay. Bad news, they didn't have the tool to protect those credentials, and it doesn't sound like robust multi-factor authentication. And by the way, by robust, not just having it at the gateway of the VPN, but like persistently challenging it, right? One of the things that we learned from some of the information around the Genesis marketplace is that the persistence of MFA, because we want to reduce the friction on users so we don't challenge them every time. Well, hell, if it's an admin account, man, you want to be challenging it every 12 hours and really making sure that you're not giving that kind of persistence, because that's one problem. Another thing that was interesting from the report is ignoring the EDR report. And I'm the first to admit, if you've got a poorly tuned security tool, it is the most annoying experience on the planet. When I first started my job at UNB, we had QRadar, God love it, but it was not configured properly to actually give me stuff that I cared about and would do something about. So I would wake up in the morning and I would kid you not, I had 50,000 alerts a day in the SIM. And trust me, there was lots of bad things that it was alerting me. There's lots that I couldn't do about. And by the time I got done spending 6 months trimming it down, I had 50 alerts per day that I still wasn't resourced to deal with, but at least I could deal with it. So, when we were talking earlier about not having the EDR, I think even something worse than having an EDR and having so many alerts coming from it that you don't even pay attention to it. That's probably, again, even worse than having nothing. So it's interesting. I think one of the things I was trying to get my head around with this story was, okay, what's the penalty actually going to be? And that is a very open question on this one, because the litany of sins here in the allegation, pretty damning. But what's the actual consequence going to look like?
Well, the attackers, who, according to reports, demanded $10 million, they were really nasty.
Yeah. The first data file this group leaked was reproductive health, abortions. The second data file they leaked was mental health. I mean, this is villainy and the amount of heartbreak and cost. And I'll be honest, it got the attention of the Australian government. Like Claire O'Neill, the Minister for Cyber and Home Affairs, like they got serious about it. So I would suggest Medibank's in for a bad go, but we'll see, because jurisprudence on this is going to be wacky, because if they get hit with $2.2 million per incident times 9.7 million, that's probably bigger than Australia's GDP. I mean, if the company makes billions, it has a $500 million profit, this would drive them out of business. And the math on that, crazy town.
Well, the Information Commissioner is going to argue before a judge that a reasonable expectation was that Medibank should have adopted more stringent security measures, including implementing multi-factor authentication on its VPN, as well as having MFA on systems with sensitive data. And it would also have been reasonable to expect that Medibank would restrict access to sensitive information to only those who needed it. And without saying so, someone who didn't need it would be a third-party help desk employee.
Oh, these are like the 7 deadly sins of cybersecurity here, right? Like, least access privilege, proper authentication controls, proper monitoring of things. Hell, even like, how is it that this admin account escalated in whatever way? I hope we get more details about. Ends up getting the detailed health information of 9.7 million people. Like somewhere is someone with the CIS top 20 is rolling around in their grave crying, right? Like this is awful.
All right, let's move on to news item 3. More on the Snowflake data breaches. As we've reported before, Mandiant says most of the data thefts from firms that subscribe to and use the Snowflake data analytics service can be blamed on stolen passwords of customers. Mandiant said at least some of the successful passwords came from the computers of IT contractors who worked for customers. So this week, a reporter at Wired added a new detail. A hacker told the publication, allegedly, that one contractor it got passwords from was a Ukrainian employee of an American IT services firm. This firm, which also has offices in Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic, well, one of its specialties is helping IT departments maintain their Snowflake accounts. This firm is a Snowflake elite partner. So this employee could have had login credentials for more than one Snowflake customer that they dealt with. The hacker that Wired spoke to claimed that the passwords it stole from the consulting employee were unencrypted. This consulting firm, by the way, denies that it played a role in the hacks. But the Wired report does raise questions about whether IT leaders know enough about the security practices of consulting firms that their IT departments are hiring, especially those that specialize in sensitive database applications like Snowflake, SAP, Oracle, and others. What do you think?
Well, first, I mean, if this is true, which is a big if, because liar, liar, pants on fire, and cyber criminals, but if it's true, I think you raise a really good point that it shouldn't just be people thinking about Snowflake. And again, I think this gets back into everything we're talking about now this year is this third party, and now we're getting into fourth party. Can't wait till we have our fifth party breach. Like it was the milkman delivering to the IT service provider who got his password popped, and then they got popped, and then they got popped, and then you got popped. Like we're just into lunacy that they just highlight the house of cards that we've built with IT and the race for either finding incredibly scarce talent, keeping out on it. And again, I reiterate, and this is not to the CISO, who are probably listening to this, nodding their head, going, hallelujah. Please feel free to share this clip from this point forward to your CEOs and your CFOs. Penny wise, pound foolish. The rush to find lowest bidder, lowest IT outsourcer on this without appropriate contractual and technical control is going to increasingly cost you more and more money. If you're going to do the outsourcing game, you better have good technical controls to support them working safely in your environment, really good clarity, and I mean crystal clarity on the shared security responsibilities and a practice instant response plan with a tabletop of third and fourth party as the scenario. Because this is the fifth, sixth major story we're talking about this year that's starting to get into this level of craziness. And if you're not thinking of these things, you should be thinking about how to resource this internally because you're not ready for the consequences.
So, what are the best practices for IT leaders when they're hiring an outsider contractor and allowing them onto the network?
Oh, well, number one, the conversations I'm having, the amount of times we're like, should we be requiring our contractor to sign up on our policies and do security awareness training? Hell's to the yes. But by the way, don't just feed them the standard vendor password thing. Cool. But actually explain your expectation. Take some time to explain the rules of the road, how they're to use those tools. And then secondly, like a hotel, think about, you don't let your guests necessarily run amok throughout your hotel. You've got them segmented into their rooms in the appropriate access. Hell, if they want to go to the fitness center, they got to tap their card on there. That is my analogy for constant authentication. We talk a lot about zero trust. Zero trust to your contractors, man.
Yeah. All right. And finally, you wanted to talk about some late breaking news. CDK Global, which makes cloud-based software for running car dealerships in the US and Canada, has acknowledged being hit by a cyber attack. According to CBS News, CDK software is used by 15,000 car dealerships in the US alone. I'm not sure whether it's widely used in Canada because it only started being made available last month. But CDK had to temporarily shut most of its IT systems on Wednesday. Some of them were up later on Wednesday. However, according to the industry publication Automotive News, CDK had to shut its systems again on Thursday after another attack. This could be really serious.
It could. And so I personally know my car dealership is impacted by it. I dropped my car off yesterday and they're like, oh, our system's down. And I thought, this is going to be fun. So I called for an update of my car today and I was like, oh, is your system still down? I said, yeah. I said, by any chance, do you use CDK? And they're like, yep.
Ooh.
So yeah. And what we've seen this afternoon is they have said, at a minimum, the system's not coming back up today. And so this is day 2. And keep in mind, this is the inventory system. This is the part. This is closing deals. Like, car dealers had a rough couple of years, man. They're just starting to get their feet back underneath them.
Yep.
I have so much empathy right now. These are small businesses for the large part. And they're an important part of their communities and a very important part of GDP for North America. And there are cascading effects. Like, the reason I find this so interesting is, number one, God forbid that this is another Snowflake like Ticketmaster, millions upon people's detailed financial records out the door. That's very much top of my mind. Like, how bad is this? What kind of data are we talking about? Because in the US, the car dealerships are subject to very strict safeguarding rules from the FTC, including having to have an qualified individual and a security program. And I guarantee you that is very rare thing among a lot of those car dealerships. And if this is as widespread as it is, it's a nightmare scenario. So that's concern number one. Concern number two is what happens here is a ripple-on effect in the economy. So if we're out a week, or say we have a London drugs here, and this turns into 9 days of not selling cars, well, what that ends up being is inventory doesn't get sold. So then stuff's piling up, factory orders start slowing down. Like, this has a order of magnitude, tens of millions of dollars potential impact every day it goes on that hurt a lot of everyday people, the car buyers, the car dealers, the car manufacturers, etc. My final thought on this is this. This is what I would call the third rail of American society. So we saw the Colonial Pipeline. They messed with gasoline, man. Then they messed with JBS meat. They were after the steaks. Now they're after the cars. And if this doesn't start World War III, I don't know, but this is one surefire way to piss off the United States of America, is to mess with their cars.
We are going to keep close watch on this developing news. That's it for this edition. David, I want to thank you very, very much for being with us this week.
Thank you so much, Howard. This episode brought to you by the letter P for persistence, for the Chinese crew that was there for 3 years. And remember, kid, you don't have to be advanced, but you have to be persistent.
Links to details about news mentioned in this podcast episode are in the text version at technewsday.com. Follow Cybersecurity Today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or add us to your flash briefing on your smart speaker. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend. I'm Howard Solomon.